Good afternoon. Today, being that it is the 9th of Av, the saddest day in the Jewish history and Jewish calendar, as we mourn the destruction of the two temples that have happened about 500 years apart, we will today discuss concerning, and being that the topics of discussion can only be about mourning and destruction, about sad things about the era of the temple. So we'll go through a little bit of what happened and the lessons that we can learn about the concepts when we talk about the destruction of the temple. The Talmud tells us that one who does not have the temple built in his time is as if the temple was destroyed. That every single one of us at every single time and moment have to feel the sadness and mourn the loss of the destruction of the temple. But what does the Talmud juxtapose it with? The concept of that the temple has to be rebuilt. That means it's not just merely mourning the destruction of the temple, but it's also learning and looking what we build a holy temple. Let's take, for example, as we discussed at length last Friday, at any prophecy that we talk about, the destruction and the demolition of the temple, that same prophet goes on at length and talks about the building and construction of the temple. Take, for example, Isaiah. Isaiah talks about in the prophecy of Isaiah that we read last Shabbat in the Haftorah. Isaiah mentions of how God is disgusted by the prayers of the Jews, and therefore the temple will be destroyed. But then he concludes about the rebuilding of the temple. And the majority of the book of Isaiah talks about the salvation of the Jewish people, of how they will be there to see the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, and what will happen in the time of the coming of Mashiach, and so on. Or even Jeremiah. Jeremiah talks about the concepts of the destruction of the temple. He prophesies seeing the destruction of the temple. He even attests to the fact that he was there at the destruction of the first temple, as we read in the book of Lamentations, chapter 3, Ani HaGever, I am the one. But then also Jeremiah talks about a time when they will be sitting in the cities of Jerusalem, and there will be the noise and the chatter that will come back again. Every single moment and every single prophet and every single prophecy that talks about the destruction, at the same time also talks about the rebuilding of what will come to be. A very teaching and telling moment, and a very important lesson that we learn from this. But let's take it even a step further. And let's talk about what happened by one of the destructions of the temple, by the second temple destruction. The Talmud tells us that what happened because of the siege that was laid in Jerusalem, and how the destruction of the temple came about, of the baseless hatred of the Jewish people not getting along, whether it was the different factions that were destroying one another, fighting in the civil unrest that existed amongst the Jews at the time, which allowed them to be given over to the Romans, or the Romans to actually conquer because of it, the siege that is set. And one of the stories that the Talmud mentions is about a story about a fellow of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, about a story where a person made this beautiful banquet, and the messenger, the courier, delivered the invitation to the wrong address, and instead of inviting his friend, he invited his enemy. And because of that, the host of the banquet chased this fellow out in degradation and embarrassment, and nobody protested. With that, he went to the Roman emperor and he said that the Jews are rebelling against you. When the Roman emperor said the Jews are rebelling against you, he said, how do I know? They've been paying their taxes, everything has been fine. He says, look, send a sacrifice, see if they'll bring it. And he gave this fellow a sacrifice to bring to the Holy Temple to be brought. On the way, this fellow made a scratch in its lip, for which the Romans was not considered a blemish, but for the Jews it's considered a blemish. He brings it to the Holy Temple, and he wants to bring it as a sacrifice, as it came from the emperor. However, the Kohanim said it has a blemish, we can't. So they said, let's change it. So then one of the fellows there, his name was Charyah ben Afkilah, said, people will then say that if one brings an animal with a blemish, then it has to be transferred. They said, let's kill him. They said, think if somebody brings an animal with a blemish, he gets killed. Let's reject it, but then the emperor is going to get upset. Eventually, they would reject the animal. The emperor was upset, and that began the downturn to the destruction of the temple. The humility of Reb Zechariah that the temple was destroyed. What was he saying? What was his humility? What was he doing wrong? What happened here? What was Zechariah so concerned about? Isn't all of the Jewish people's lives in danger? What was wrong that he was reprimanded, that he's blamed for the destruction of the temple? But here's one more story, which will sum it up and give us a better understanding and appreciation of what all of these are come together and what they teach us. The Talmud tells us of another story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was walking with his friends. Rabbi Akiva was a person that lived during the destruction of the Second Temple. He was eventually killed by the Romans after the destruction of the Second Temple. And Rabbi Akiva was walking with his friends, and as it tells us in the end of the tractate of Makos, and he hears the great energy that's coming from the headquarters from the Romans. And his friends are very saddened by it. And Rabbi Akiva starts laughing. And Rabbi Akiva, they ask him, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? Rabbi Akiva said, if this is what God does to the people that hate him, how much more so he's going to reward to those that enjoy and follow his instructions. Then they continued walking and they come to Temple Mount. And they see by Temple Mount that at the time Temple Mount was plowed. And Foxen are walking out of Temple Mount. With that, his sages that walk with him tear their clothes in sadness and mourning to see a place where even if a Jew that was an Israelite entered, was liable of the death penalty. And over here, all of a sudden, it's plowed and foxes are roaming around it. And Rabbi Akiva again chuckled. To this, the sages looked at him and said, Rabbi Akiva, how can you chuckle? What's the glory here? This is a place, the holiest of all places. And today, foxen are walking there. It's plowed to the ground. This was a place that holiness imbued. One was able to see true spirituality. And today, there's nothing there. Not only nothing, but foxen are roaming there. And to which Rabbi Akiva responded and exclaimed. He says, now I know that the prophecy that tells me that this same place will be again a place of resurgence, of joy and of laughter is going to happen. Because Rabbi Akiva said, if this prophecy happened, that Zion will be plowed with the field, occurred, then I know that the prophecy that follows, that there will come a time that there will be joyous occasions and jubilation and excitement in the cities of Jerusalem will happen as well. And with that, the sages told him, Akiva, you have consoled us. Akiva, you have consoled us. What is the story here? What's going on over here? What did Rabbi Akiva see that the sages didn't see? What was the reason why Rabbi Akiva laughed while the sages cried? What was Rabbi Akiva putting together? Rabbi Akiva taught us a fundamental lesson in life. Rabbi Akiva was a person who he always was known for the saying that anything that God does to you is for the good. That in any situation and predicament that we find ourselves, we are not tied or locked into that environment. It doesn't dictate who we are, what we do. It's more than just seeing it more half full, but it's being and presently taking the situation that you're in and understanding that this is not merely a time of destruction, but a time of rebuilding. And in order to rebuild, I need to demolish, like we explained on Friday. The destruction of the temple is a sad event. Tisha B'Av is a sad time. But what does Tisha B'Av mean? Is it only merely celebrating or commemorating a time of sadness that happened 2,000 years ago? Or is it a rededication as we began, as the Talmud tells us, that any person that the temple hasn't been built in their days is as if it has been destroyed? Meaning that every single time we talk about the destruction of the temple, we are thinking about not its destruction, but its rebuilding. Anytime we go through a trying time in life, and unfortunately with the challenges that we're in today, There are many people that are many times that are many trying. What are we doing about it? How do we view them? Do we view them as locked, alienated, deemed by whatever it forces us to do? Or do we look at it as a time of eventual hope? Not only eventual hope, but that eventual hope becomes now already a matter of sanctification. In fact, the Talmud goes a step further and says what the discussion over here, the argument between Rabbi Akiva and his friends, were a desecration of God's name, did it call for mourning. Rabbi Akiva believed that because of the eventual sanctification of God's name, because of the eventual good and happiness that eventually is going to come, because I see it, because I see the tragedy, then the tragedy itself is no longer a tragedy. The tragedy itself is already a good thing, is already a godly blessing. Rabbi Akiva viewed the demolition itself as a construction, the destruction of the temple, but because he saw already its eventual rebuilding as it's already rebuilt. Meaning he was able to give himself the ability to console, as we're going to read in this week's Haftorah, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, that God can comforts the Jewish people with the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. God is telling every single one of us, and every single time we commemorate the sad day of Tisha B'Av, there are many tragedies and sad days that unfortunately the Jewish people have been persecuted many. But what does it teach us? That our persecutions determine who we are, that our persecutions throw us down and therefore abandon it all. As the very famous legend goes, as Napoleon Bonaparte was then looking to do and conquer his quest and go from one place to the next, and his next journey was going to be the Middle East. And he comes to the Middle East, and it was the middle of the summer, and he walks into a temple, into a synagogue, and he sees there are people sitting on the floor crying. And he asked somebody on the side, what are they crying? Why is this sad day? And they told him that because 1,500 years ago, there was a temple that was in Jerusalem that was destroyed. And before that, 2,000 years ago, there was another temple that was destroyed. And therefore, they're crying and they're mourning its loss. And Napoleon responded and he said, a nation who 2,000 years is grieving the loss and continues to mourn about something that happened 2,000 years ago will eventually be rebuilt. The sadness and the fact that we mourn and we have this day of Tisha B'Av, it's not only about to mourn the past and to be sad about this day, but it also teaches us the resilience of the Jewish people. It teaches us of how we can reconstruct and rebuild in our life the building of the Beis HaMikdash, of the Holy Temple. The day of Tisha B'Av is not only the day that the temple was destroyed, but as we mentioned in the Talmud, the day that Mashiach was born, the day that the concept of the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash was there as well. We, on this day, not only should allow ourselves to mourn the past, the destruction of the temple, but also to rededicate ourselves to the rebuilding of the temple. To not only the temple at large, as we talk about the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, but in every single one of our lives. To remember the teachings of Rabbi Akiva, but also remember that what Rabbi Yochanan taught us, the false humility of Zechariah. Humility is not only something, there's two types of humility. There's a good humility, and then there's a bad humility. A good humility that teaches us that we can always learn, but then there's a humility which is a low self-esteem, a humility which tells us not to do, to give us to say, you know what, I'm already depressed, I'm already this, I'm already that, and a giving up hope. What's it going to help? As one of the commentators explained, that Zechariah saw that the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, was going to be destroyed anyway. So therefore he said, why bother? It's going to be destroyed. But he didn't realize that a Jew can change the predicament. A Jew has the ability to change the situation. We are never compelled to act or to be just because that's the way it is. We can always change the situation. Tisha B'Av reminds us, don't be locked into your situation. Don't confine yourself by what you think your self-limitations and your self-inhibitations. Tisha B'Av tells us that this is a time of rebirth, the time of the coming of Mashiach. As Rabbi Akiva sees in the prophecy of destruction, he sees the prophecy of rebuilding. We have the ability to be comforted and understand and appreciate that we can rebuild, that we will rebuild, not only the Holy Temple and the Beis HaMikdash, but ourselves, our connection to God, our resilience of the Jewish people is forever strong and will forever last. That as long as we commit and dedicate ourselves and understand and appreciate what it takes to continue to cultivate that relationship, it will always be there. As we started off the prophecy of Isaiah, the prophecy of Isaiah was a vision of destruction, but at the same time, he saw a vision of rebuilding. Jeremiah saw the destruction, but at the same time, he also saw the eventual dancing in the streets of Jerusalem. In every occasion in our life where it looks like a destruction, it looks like it's absolute bleak, we should remember that we can make this the ultimate joy, the ultimate dancing, the jubilation dancing in the streets of Jerusalem, that we will see that joy. And hopefully even before this fast finishes on Tisha B'Av, we will merit to see the joy, the dancing, and the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. That Tisha B'Av will be the great celebration that our prophets tell us, as we read in the book of Lamentations. It will be that holiday, that celebration. May it be now. Amen. Thank you all for tuning in. Tomorrow we'll see you again, 1 p.m., as we will discuss the Torah reading of this week. Have an easy fast. The fast finishes today at 8:42. And have a meaningful rest of Tisha B'Av. All the best.